Hi, teachers. Welcome back to another episode of Strongman. And I am here today with my good friend and author, Kenneth C. Davis, to talk about the second in the list of 5 strongmen that Kenneth talked about in his book, Strongman, The Rise of 5 Dictators and the Fall of Democracy. And democracy is really at the core of what we're discussing in this series, the fall of democracy and the dictators that in the 20th century that were a part of it. My name is Jessica Ellison, and I'm a teacher educator at the Minnesota Historical Society. And today we are going to be talking about probably the most famous, or one of the most famous dictators of the 20th century, Adolf Hitler. And this episode is called The Big Lie. And we are going to dive into talking about Hitler and talking about what that big lie is. And you'll see some pretty interesting primary sources here on the screen. And we are definitely going to look into those after we have a chance to talk a little bit with Ken. So Ken, hello, how are you?
Greetings, Jessica. Thanks for having me again. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, me too. So in the last episode, we talked about Mussolini and sort of this strongman's playbook, that Mussolini was in large part responsible for a lot of the work that was done by other dictators in the 20th century. So can you talk a little bit about how Hitler saw that work and began to build a dictatorship of his own?
Absolutely. I'll preface that by saying I usually say that talking about history is fun. I like to have fun with history. Of course, this history is not fun, and it is perhaps the most important history that we can learn and understand, especially in a time when ideas like democracy are in peril and strong men are on the move around the world. So this is really an imperative for us to learn and understand from the past and bring those lessons to the present. As we talked about in the first episode, Mussolini preceded Hitler. Mussolini, a World War I veteran who came to power in Italy in the early 1920s. Adolf Hitler, also a World War I veteran, very, very bitter that Germany had been defeated in World War I and was used that bitterness, that anger, that sense of grievance that many strong men like to play upon to build his following. He was speaking to Germans at a time when Germany was beaten, distraught, economically impoverished. They had been through the war, and Germany had suffered grievously in the war. Many young German men had died. They'd also suffered through the Spanish flu, which probably killed about 400,000 Germans. So Germany was an economic and social and political disaster for the most part in the 1920s, but they did have a constitution. It was known as the Weimar Constitution, written after the end of World War I. And it was very progressive in many respects. It gave women the vote, for instance. It made labor unions legal. It allowed for religious freedom in Germany, which actually brought Jews from other parts of Europe to Germany, thinking they'd be more protected there. So Germany was in dire straits in many respects, but it did have the beginnings of a vibrant, progressive democracy. Hitler eventually comes to power. He watches Mussolini make his march on Rome, and he tries to do the same thing in Munich with something called the Beer Hall Push. It doesn't work. It's put down by the army right away. Hitler is treated rather leniently and put in, it's called prison, but he basically had a private room with some of his friends in a prison. And it's during that time he writes the most famous book one of the most famous books of the 20th century, Mein Kampf, My Will. And that book lays out Hitler's ideas about what Germany should be and why it's fallen so low. And he blames outsiders, foreigners, Jews, bankers. He blames the German soldiers and military men who agreed to the surrender. He calls them backstabbers. So he has this tremendous sense of grievance. Now, when he goes out and starts to talk to people around Germany about this, he's not giving them new ideas. He's expressing an ideal that ideas that a lot of people feel, ideas that many people thought were true, but he gave voice to them in this very, very profoundly dramatic way. And he had people flock to him. He certainly grows the Nazi Party in a very short period of time from a few hundred members to tens of thousands of members. And eventually they are able to, through elections, become one of the leading parties in the German legislature, which is called the Reichstag. Like Mussolini, Hitler is eventually asked to become the chancellor or prime minister of Germany. So he had followed Mussolini's trail perfectly. One of the things he talked about, though, in Mein Kampf is very important, is what we're talking about here, the big lie, the use of propaganda. For Hitler, part of that big lie was blaming other people for all of the ills of Germany, including his very, very pronounced and vocal anti-Semitism, that the Jews were somehow responsible for the problems in Germany. So all of this begins in the 1920s and accelerates. Then Hitler is made Chancellor of Germany. He uses the crisis when the German parliament is burned down and to attack communists as another group that is trying to destroy Germany. And with that, he is able to take complete control of Germany by legal means, given the power to essentially become a dictator. So in a very short space of time, Germany goes from a constitutional democracy to a one-party state led by Hitler, who is known as the Führer, the leader.
And how did the German people react to this? I mean, as you say, a really short amount of time, this big change was made. So in general, how did the Germans react?
Well, once again, we have the situation where democracy does not die in darkness. It dies in broad daylight as millions cheer. Germans were exhausted, poor, chaotic. They were fearful. They were fearful of the growing power of socialism and Bolshevism. They had watched what happened in Russia, where the Bolsheviks, the communists, had taken over. Socialism had taken over. They had seen the Tsar of Russia, the king, the monarch of Russia, and his family executed rather brutally. Of course, communism was atheistic, so the church was very afraid of the role. And the Communist Party and socialism were very powerful in Germany at this time. For working class people, they were providing a solution. They were saying the workers should be in charge. We do all the work. We should be the ones who are deciding what the country does. And this was a very powerful difference and a very powerful conflict in many places around Europe at this time. The same thing had been happening in Mussolini's Italy. So Germans were very, very open to Hitler's ideas that Germany's greatness of the past should be restored. It had only been brought down because of foreigners. Again, these are the techniques. Powerful nationalist, populist, the sense that the greatness of the past needs to be restored, the sense that there's a great crisis that only the leader can solve, and finally that there's law and order must be brought to bear to restore the sense of the country functioning properly. So all of these four aspects are brought together in Hitler and Mussolini as the way that the strong man takes power. And then once he's in power, he uses that power to cement his complete hold on the country.
And then the next step we see then is the war and the Holocaust. And so how do we get from Hitler kind of taking advantage of where Germans were and their fear, and really infecting the country with anti-Semitism, to killing millions of people in camps?
It is a difficult and sometimes unthinkable idea, but it happened. And one of the most important things that we must do as educators, I feel, because we are in an era of propaganda and fake news, and we do have people saying that this event in history did not happen, is to overcome that. This certainly did happen when I speak about the Holocaust. Um, not only the murder of 6 million Jews, but the murder of millions and millions of Eastern Europeans who Hitler wanted to get rid of to expand Germany into Eastern Europe. So this is a really important moment when some of these ideas are being bandied about in education, certainly in popular media, in social media. So I really feel that this is an important duty that we have as educators to make this clear that this did happen. Let me first go back to what we were talking about briefly and re-emphasize how Hitler was, especially in the early years, successful. And the German people looked to him as a great success. He'd taken this broken country. First of all, he rearmed it, which was breaking the treaty that they had made after World War II. He rebuilt the military. And of course, the army was very happy to go along with that. And we have to remember, with all of these strongmen, none of them can accomplish what they accomplished without lots of willing accomplices. And for Hitler and for Mussolini, the military is an accomplice. For both of these men, industrial leaders, businessmen who want to restore the economy are willing to go along with them. They also are very fearful of socialism, which says we're going to come in and we're going to take over the factories. So there was widespread support for, and there's the religious aspect of it as well. The church was very supportive of Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy, because they were going to push back against godless communism and socialism. So all of those factors lead to the popularity of these men in their countries. And as I said, Hitler's quite successful. He builds roads. The Autobahn, the famous German highways, are built under Hitler. We have pictures of him with a shovel, making the first dig in the ground to build the Autobahn. He is able to get the Olympics to come to Germany in 1936 and builds all these extraordinary arenas around the country in Munich and Berlin. So this is a sense that these men are able to accomplish the things that they've set out to do. And that's very much important in terms of their willingness, the willingness of the people to go along with them. They see something that seems to be working. They see their country's greatness being restored. And of course, it's all centered on this one figure. So that by well into the 1930s, when Hitler goes to Nuremberg, which is where they would have these rallies, hundreds of thousands of people are there cheering every step of the way. And that also is filmed by a very famous film director named Leni Riefenstahl, a woman who makes a movie about Hitler and the rise of Nazis. And that piece of propaganda is shown around Germany, and every school child watches it. And they see this glowing, godlike Führer, leader, descending out of the heavens on an airplane and coming down, and throngs of people cheering him. This is powerful propaganda, and it created that whole generation that was completely devoted to Hitler. So these are the ways that they take power and then cement their hold on the country. What Hitler did certainly was part of his program was to expand Germany's size. He believed that Germany, he didn't care so much about an empire around the world, but he wanted Germany to expand, especially into Eastern Europe. And for that, he wanted to eliminate what he called, what he thought of as the lower races, the secondary races, the Slavic people, Eastern Europeans. He thought that they were less than Germans, who were the master race. And Germans bought into this, and they were eager to expand into Eastern Europe. And long before World War World War II begins, Hitler is pressing his demands to move out. And of course, they're granted in some respects by some of the Western countries who want to avoid a war. But a war was eventually inevitable. And in September 1939, Hitler goes into Poland. And because of that, World War II begins. And ultimately, Hitler, like Mussolini, is brought down with at the enormous cost of World War II being fought over 4 years' time.
So what would you say is the lesson or a lesson that we can pull from this story in the present?
One of the most important lessons, I think, from all of these men is a very, very difficult lesson. And I think a lot of students are learning this these days when we talk about bullying. I'm sure it's talked about in your schools, Jessica. A lot of students are learning that there are 3 ways to respond to a bully. One is you collaborate. Collaborate means you go along with the bully. And you do that because you might be afraid that the bully's going to pick on you otherwise, but it also maybe feels good that you're able to put somebody else down. That gives you a sense of power. So collaboration. The second is to be a bystander. The bystander isn't actually collaborating and joining in with the bully, but he's, or she is stepping back and saying, gee, as long as it doesn't affect me, I'm okay with it. The last and the most difficult is the upstander. And the upstander says, no, this is wrong. You have to stop bullying. Well, dictators are bullies on steroids, essentially. We have to say that these, and so the response is very much the same. And you have to ask yourself, are you a collaborator going to join the dictator? Are you a bystander? Somebody who's willing to let what the dictator does because maybe it's even good for you, but you don't want to get involved? Or are you going to be an upstander and resist and say, no, this is wrong. This goes against our principles. This goes against my principles. I must speak out against this. Now, I say that it's difficult and even dangerous because the story in Strongman is that most of the upstanders in the cases of these 5 men, ended up dead or imprisoned or at best sometimes expelled from their countries. So it's a risky thing to be an upstander. But I think that that's the ultimate lesson, not only of Hitler's period, but all of these strong men. How do we respond to such a threat to our rights, our freedoms, our democracy?
Absolutely. That's such an important lesson. And I think that we can use these stories and the sources that go with them to give students a foundation for how these things happen. Because sometimes when you're in the middle of it, it's hard to see the forest for the trees. And so I'm going to share some primary sources from Hitler's era, and we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of dehumanizing and us versus them. That was very much something that Hitler used in the 1930s and 40s. As you can see on the right, this poster of this German student looking very tall and strong and regal and handsome and being this sort of ideal image of a German, of a human being. But then you see on the left, this is from Dachau, and these are the symbols that were attached to prisoners in the camps, and all the different colors meant different things. And so we recognize the Star of David, the 2 yellow triangles for Jewish individuals, but then there were also colors such as red for political prisoners and pink for homosexuals, and other colors that meant different things that you could then layer on another yellow triangle to say this person is a political prisoner and a Jew. And so it's this way of separating people and creating an us versus them dichotomy, which made it really difficult for people to see that these were all human beings. So when you're talking with students about this era, bringing in images like this gets to the heart of the us versus them argument and can help students start to see that in the world around them so that they can choose to be upstanders and not bystanders. So thank you for joining us today. The resources here and others are available at this URL, bit.ly/strongman with a capital S 2020. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at jessica.ellison@mnhs.org. Thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.